You know what's oddly unsettling? An entire generation was raised to believe they were unique, pushed themselves harder than expected, did everything they were told was right, and still ended up unable to afford the kind of life that felt completely normal just one generation earlier. That's a psychological experiment no one agreed to participate in. I'm talking about millennials, those born between 1981 and 1996. And before you dismiss this, stay with me, because this gets uncomfortable in ways most people never really examine. Millennials became the first generation in modern American history expected to be financially worse off than their parents. The Pew Research Center confirmed this in 2020. That means you now have an entire demographic carrying around a strange mental blend of accomplishment and failure at the same time every single day. Imagine spending your entire childhood being told you could become anything, achieve anything, win at anything, only to graduate straight into a recession where the modern version of a participation trophy turns into a master's degree that costs more than a house used to. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, and millennials are essentially living inside it. But this goes far beyond student loans or jokes about avocado toast. Psychologist Jean Twenge devoted an entire book, Generation Me, to studying this exact pattern. Her research showed that millennials score higher on measures of narcissism compared to previous generations. But here's the part that complicates everything. They also score higher on anxiety and depression. So you end up with a generation that's been conditioned to believe they're exceptional while simultaneously feeling deeply inadequate. A trauma response wrapped in a resume. Take a second to really think about that timeline. Millennials were effectively the testing ground for every parenting trend that emerged from the self-esteem movement of the 80s and 90s. Helicopter parenting, universal trophies, constant reassurance that simply existing made you special. These ideas weren't malicious. They were sincere attempts to raise healthier, more confident kids using the best psychological understanding available at the time. Then millennials entered their 20s just as the economy collapsed in 2008. They graduated into a job market that had fundamentally transformed and were suddenly forced to survive in an economic reality they had never been prepared for. That level of psychological whiplash alone should have come with a warning label. And then there was social media. Millennials didn't grow up with it as children like Gen Z. They encountered it as teenagers and young adults, right while their identities were still taking shape. Facebook launched in 2004. Instagram followed in 2010. That means millennials learned how to be adults while also learning how to perform their lives for an invisible audience. Research by Dr. Tim Kasser on materialism and well-being shows that when people tie their self-worth to external validation, which is exactly what social media trains you to do, mental health suffers. You're essentially running a non-stop campaign for your own existence, and the polls never close. Now add another layer. Millennials are delaying or skipping the traditional milestones that once gave people a clear sense of adulthood. Marriage, home ownership, children. Surveys show they want these things just as much as previous generations did. But the economic reality makes them nearly unattainable without family wealth or extraordinary luck. So you end up with people in their 30s and 40s who still feel like their real life hasn't started yet, except the waiting room is a tiny apartment that costs $2,200 a month and a therapist who's booked for months. The psychological toll of that kind of prolonged uncertainty is well documented. When the markers society uses to define adulthood become unreachable, your brain doesn't simply adjust and move on. Instead, it creates a constant background stress known as allostatic load, your body's habit of preparing for a future event that never actually arrives. It's like being stuck on the loading screen of your own life, watching a progress bar that hasn't moved in years. Now here's something that hits even closer to home. Millennials were sold a very specific promise about how effort was supposed to translate into results. Work hard, study, go to college, get a good job, climb the ladder. That social contract sounded reasonable, and for a long time it actually worked. The problem is that the economic landscape shifted in ways almost no one anticipated. When millennials showed up ready to follow that path, they found a world where college costs nearly 10 times what it once did, Entry-level jobs demand years of experience, and the reward is massive debt paired with a gig economy where you're labeled an independent contractor with no benefits. When reality directly contradicts your core beliefs about how the world functions, psychologists call this schema disruption. And when that happens across an entire generation, the result isn't just frustration, it fundamentally reshapes how people relate to institutions, authority, and the idea of a stable future. That's why millennials are often described as both idealistic and deeply cynical at the same time. They still believe things should be fair, they just no longer expect fairness to exist. That's pattern recognition at work. And then there's the issue of jobs. Millennials get endlessly criticized for job hopping and lacking loyalty to companies. What's psychologically interesting about that critique is that corporate America had already transformed the employment relationship long before millennials adapted to it. Pensions disappeared. Full-time roles turned into contract work. Mass layoffs became a routine business strategy. Millennials didn't invent this lack of loyalty. They adjusted to a system that had already changed. That's not entitlement. That's survival in an environment that treats workers as interchangeable. There's another factor that rarely gets enough attention. Millennials are among the most educated and most diverse generations in history. Yet when people define them, the first thing that often comes up is teenage internet culture. They grew up online, and that creates a very specific psychological profile, one that questions everything because they've seen how easily truth changes depending on who controls the narrative. People who challenge the status quo often get labeled as difficult or entitled, but critical thinking colliding with systems that were never meant to be questioned will always look like that. The mental health conversation is also different for millennials. They're the first generation to broadly destigmatize therapy and openly discuss anxiety and depression as real conditions rather than personal flaws. That matters. The problem is, they're doing it while living under objectively higher stress. Student debt levels that were once unimaginable, housing costs that have skyrocketed far beyond wage growth, job insecurity built directly into the modern economy. The result is a strange dynamic where they're more self-aware, yet more overwhelmed at the same time. And then there's the future. Millennials are also the generation watching the planet actively deteriorate while being told they're responsible for fixing it, despite having far less institutional power and fewer resources to make meaningful change. Existential dread mixed with helplessness. Climate anxiety is now a recognized psychological phenomenon, and millennials are right at the center of it. So what you're left with is a generation shaped by extreme expectations, economic instability, constant performance pressure, delayed adulthood, and a front-row seat to multiple overlapping crises. Then society looks at them and asks, "Why are you so anxious? Why can't you just buy a house?" The psychology of millennials becomes remarkably predictable once you look at what they've been through. They're responding exactly the way humans do when the ground shifts beneath them and the map they were given no longer matches reality. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit the join button and become a channel member. I genuinely appreciate the support.